It became abundantly clear during the Convention of Thorns that the newly formed Camarilla had no desire for the Ravnos to join their sect, and once it was over and dealt with, they, along with the Giovanni, the followers of Set, and the Banu Hakim, were considered independents. They would stay out of the affairs of the Camarilla, as would the Ivory Tower theirs. Unless, of course, these independents threatened the Masquerade in ways too severe to be tolerated. An uneasy truce was agreed upon, the Banu Hakim receiving the worst end of these deals. Yet the Ravnos cared little for the exclusion of their own clan from high society. As I have mentioned before, the greatest enemy to a Ravnos was another Ravnos. The conflicts between the many families or jati of the clan did not cease at any point, but rather evolved. The previously mentioned Sybarites, the so-called Roman Ravnos, were more than happy to side with the newly formed army of the Sword of Cain. It is unclear what drove so many of their numbers to side with the Tzimitzi and La Sombra, but presumably the somewhat unrestrained unlife that they offered. Many of them would eventually abandon the path of paradox completely, preferring the even more monstrous paths developed by their new sect. The Alexandrites, descendants of Ramesu who traveled to North Africa, would eventually disperse, ceasing to be a faction altogether and instead either joining with the Rroma-related Ravnos or the Sybarites and the Sabbat. A former soldier of Alexander the Great's army by the name of Fedime had been embraced by the Dark Mother during the campaign into India, and upon her return to Europe would form the Federated Lineage, a small visionary group of Ravnos who would come to embrace chivalry and honor, potentially to stave off their clan's weakness. Fedime settled in Gaul, carving out a domain for her and her kind, which would provoke the local Ventru and Gangrel into conflict, as they considered these lands to be theirs. Fedime and her line would eventually vanish into the annals of history as well, but few if any of them would end up joining the Sabbat, as they were enemies with the Sybarites. Interestingly, while their moral philosophies were quite different, the Fedimites did not kill any intruding Sybarites on the basis of that, but rather because they were considered a nuisance and possibly a threat. Other branches of the Ravnos family tree would likewise be welcomed with hostility, but the Sybarites in particular were singled out, possibly because of their insistence to try to spread their influence in Fedimite territory. Another offshoot of the clan were the Basharites, established by a Ravnos who happened to be in what is today Israel when a new religion sprung into being. By melding the beliefs of the Path of Paradox with the new branch of Judaism that was developing, this ultimately resulted in an apocalyptic cult who held very firmly to the ideas presented in the Book of Revelations, even believing that it was their divine duty to bring the world to an end and for Christ to return. Ultimately, these Basharites would become a strange but soon forgotten chapter of their clan's history, as the second coming of Christ never happened, despite their efforts of slaughtering pilgrims and one of them even believing herself to be the Antichrist. They, like the Sybarites, would find solace in the Sabbat, where vampiric faith would at least partially alleviate the despair of a cult who had lost its ways. The Ravnos who ended up joining the Sabbat were almost all of them unaligned with the Rroma. Thus, this would further strengthen the idea amongst the Western kindred that the Ravnos were a Rroma clan, despite having arrived in Europe long before they did. The Ravnos themselves did not care too much what the other clans thought, happy to be left to their own devices, yet rivalries would continue, and the Sabbat Ravnos now instead proselytizing to their non-sect clanmates about the wonders of the Sword of Cain. Somewhere between a third and half of all Western Ravnos would end up joining the Sabbat, embracing the sect's ideas of freedom above all. In mindset, they varied little from the main body of the clan, but they would, aside from having a spit and shake code of conduct when it comes to verbal agreements, also offer contracts written in the Ravnos' own blood. These deals would be binding until either completed or upon the final death of the Ravnos in question. Naturally, the anti-tribu would rarely, if ever, employ such an extreme measure to seal a deal, but it was not unheard of. A habit picked up by the Ravnos in Europe was what they would come to refer to as the treatment. Words differ on what the treatment is, but it is described as an extreme measure employed against the most egregious of princes who really need to be taught a lesson. No Ravnos will invoke the treatment on a prince who asks them to leave, or upon an elder who has their ghouls stake out the Ravnos' temporary haven. Were it to happen more frivolously, it would teach most kindred that it would be better to have the Ravnos just quietly disappear than to make a big stink about it. No, the treatment is reserved for when a statement truly needs to be made, and it must be agreed upon by those who are summoned to the call. The Ravnos, while they may not like each other, do keep in touch. In the past, they would leave messages either in known safe houses or with mortals whom they trusted. They would inform each other where they were heading, how long they planned to stay, and what they intended to do. This was a safety precaution, and one obviously employed so that only clanmates who were trusted would know. In the modern nights, at least before the Week of Nightmares, this would become much easier with the advent of phones and emails. If the local prince truly insulted the Ravnos visiting, caused them irreparable damage, or even outright killed them for no other reason than their clan, revenge would be called in the form of the treatment. Havoc and chaos would be brought, as the Ravnos would cause so much trouble in the domain that the prince would either have to apologize or ultimately be dethroned or even destroyed because of their inability to maintain order, stability, and of course the Masquerade. The treatment was never a weapon developed to suppress, but rather a means of defense and security for a clan that would often find itself on the receiving end of suspicion, violence, and exclusion. The mere knowledge that the Ravnos would be able to employ something to this extent was usually enough to discourage outright oppression against their clan, and that was perhaps its most important function. A deterrence, if you will. But sometimes, for some reason, kindred so dense or self-confident that they would ignore this threat would rise to power, and the threat then would need to become a reality. The Ravnos managed to keep out of most sect warfare in the time following the Anarch Revolt, excepting of course those who joined the Sabbat, and once people began to settle in North Americas, many Ravnos traveled there as well, quite a few of them enjoying the lucrative business of the slave trade. Like many other kindred, there were quite a few unscrupulous Ravnos who cared little for the suffering they caused if it meant they could line their pockets with money. The First World War had little impact on the Ravnos since the industrialization they had begun to embrace outside of the Rroma groups they had originally traveled with, but there were still many who kept to the old ways. Yet World War II caused the clan and their kin horrible damage. The Holocaust targeted any the Nazis considered inferior, and the Rroma were one of those groups. While a few Ravnos cared enough for their mortal companions to try to help them, the selfish natures of kindred would often see them manufacturing any number of reasons not to get themselves involved. It was a dark time, and one that brought much shame to the Ravnos who turned their back on the persecuted mortals. They shift the blame for these events on other clans, the Tremere often being accused of wanting to wipe out the Ravnos. But the truth is that humanity is more than capable of committing these atrocities and horrors without the guidance of the parasites living among them. The 1900s also saw India freeing itself from the British Empire's occupation and becoming its own nation, with all that that entailed. The Azuratizaya, the Kuei, would see this as an opportunity to renew their efforts in claiming this territory for theirs, and this began a conflict that would shed enough blood to eventually wake the very founder of the clan. The hierarchical, almost army-like nature of the Indian Ravnos provided a strong resistance against the encroaching Azuratizaya, especially with the aid of other clans who had come to join them. Yet ultimately the Azuratizaya would press the Ravnos to the point where old traditions had to be left behind, and newer strategies had to be embraced, including the adoption of a way of creating new kindred that can most closely be compared to the Sabbat's way of mass embracing. In Europe and America, the Ravnos would involve themselves with criminal biker gangs, hippies, and other socially isolated groups that embraced the same kind of vices that the vampires would. Most North American Ravnos were, at this point, so distant from their clan's origin that they did not even know about the conflict in India, or the Path of Paradox. That would, however, change in the early 90s as many powerful elders rose from their torpor, traveling west from India. These elders would convert many of their clan's younger members to the Maya Parisatya, the true Path of Paradox. The converts were rarely given much of a choice beyond accept it or die, and several of them were then brought back to India to join in the war against the Kuei, and in 1998, the vast majority of those who had once followed the Sybarites' corrupted Path of Paradox now instead followed the true one. Among the Indian Ravnos, there were 4 castes, very similar to the Hindi Varna, although technically 5 if you also count the Sudra, those unworthy of the embrace and instead ghouled, servants until they perished. Like the Banu Hakim, these were not simply social classes, but rather in a sense bloodlines with different powers. It is unsure whether these castes were inspired by the Hindu teaching, or vice versa, and it is unlikely that we will ever truly know. The Brahman were spiritual leaders of the Ravnos, guides of the path of paradox. The Kshatriyas were warriors, ranging from generals to foot soldiers. The Vaisyas were socially gifted diplomats and traders, and the Chandalas were the lowest ranked jati. Caitiffs and Ravnos who had broken the tenets of the path of paradox belonged to the Chandalas, and any non-Ravnos kindred would be considered one as well, but presumably treated with more respect to avoid hostile reactions. I have already spoken at length about the Week of Nightmares. Yet it is prudent to note that those who were the worst affected by the madness overtaking their clan were those Ravnos who traveled alone, or together with others of their clan. They had no way of restraining themselves, and were destroyed either by each other, by the local sheriff and their hounds, or even by unsuspecting mortals defending themselves against some maniac hopped up on angel dust. The Sabbat Ravnos, however, had long since adopted a way of living that involved membership in a pack, and many more of their kind survived the week that claimed the unlives of so many others. If one is to find a Ravnos in the modern night, chances are that they would be an anti-tribu, although it is questionable whether that epithet is still valid. These nights, there are hardly any Ravnos left, and while we do not know if efforts have been made to embrace more into their clan, they are no longer considered one of the 13, and they have become a rare sight, many recently embraced kindred not even aware of their existence. They stand as a testament and a warning about the impending judgment of the antediluvians, and in the wake of the Week of Nightmares, kindred society has changed significantly. Their numbers are 5, and they are gods. Snow, an insightful yet compassionate master, Bambi Parsons, whose passion inspires and leads by example, Dr. Sheepington, a sage and venerable keeper of ancient wisdom, and the unemployed writer whose words have guided nations throughout the aeons, are joined by Dougal, the ancient and terrifying, who stalks the night. These are our masters, and to worship them is to attain salvation. Their childer, the Methuselah, sit like kings and queens above us, their wills ours to obey. Her Satanic Majesty Dani, reborn through fire and ice, Maximilian S. Hardcastle, a master of our ancient jihad, Socrates Johnson, a scholar and mentor, and Adam Daw, wise and benevolent ruler, welcome Lauren Eason and Procyon to their midst, and at their coronation we shall bathe in the vitae of their enemies. On the Council of the Primogen are seated Edward Reed, Colin Gifford, 06, Stonewolf 18, Jokerman, Ian Nichols, the Black Friar, and Ravenfang, and their wisdom and good judgment shall serve as torchlight by which we conduct our affairs. Brad Harwick has joined the Elders, without whom our council would struggle. We thank you for your loyalty. Likewise, the Ancile Ray Crispy has excelled in our eyes and is worthy of praise. Naturally, all our elders, ancillae, and neonates receive our gratitude from the bottoms of our hearts. Without their support, this would not be possible. And thank you for watching. Now be careful out there, for Gehenna may soon be upon us.